Next up, we have the legendary Phoenix and an often misspelled palindrome, Ho-Oh, the guardian of the skies and master of the legendary beasts, has been capturing fans' hearts since the first episode of the anime, when Ash saw it fly over a rainbow. You know, back when it technically didn't really exist yet or have a name, and was hugely popular as the mascot of Pokemon Go. Now, aside from that, and of course the remake Pokemon Heart Gold, it hasn't had many other appearances, besides the cult classic Pokemon Coliseum, where it foiled Evice in a dramatic fashion, and also you had to collect and purify every single Shadow Pokemon if you wanted it for yourself, but it speaks to how iconic its original appearances are when it remains such a fan favorite without any artificial pushes from Game Freak. But as for the competitive scene, we're about to find out if it soared on its rainbow colored wings or if the turkey went bad in the oven. So let's find out, how good was Ho-Oh actually? And in this video, we'll be covering these competitive formats. In its debut generation, Ho-Oh was the so-called distinction of being the worst of the 5 Ubers, or at least tying for the spot with Celebi, which did used to be overused. As with Celebi, it's pretty unequivocally agreed to be worse overall than Snorlax, which has led to some speculation about what a Ho-Oh and Celebi GSC overused metagame would look like. The answer is extremely stally, since the two combined wall just about the entire metagame. Anyway, Ho-Oh was usually used as a general attacker that threatened burns with his signature Sacred Fire, packing great coverage with Earthquake, Thunderbolt, and occasionally as a Curse Sweeper. However, the former was underwhelming thanks to the incredible special defense stats of the other Ubers and Snorlax, as well as Celebi's Heal Bell to get rid of burns. Also, Rest Zapdos completely destroys it. Opposing Ho-Oh is the only thing in the tier that doesn't fear opposing burns at all though, so it can work on very offensive teams. The Curse Sweeper turns the tables on teams that think they can outstall it by boosting Ho-Oh's massive attack, but it does have severe move slot issues. After the obligatory Curse and Recover, it's going to be a pain to decide which two. It's not as easy to slap on as the Muse, and doesn't have as much walling ability as Lugia, thanks to significantly lower defense. Surprisingly, it's more of a niche pick within the tier, and it can be quite effective in the hands of an experienced player, but it's pretty easy to go wrong with Ho-Oh if one is lacking that experience, as it can easily just flounder around and not do too much damage from getting stalled out. Now on to Advanced, with the EV split lowering the general bulk level, Heal Bell becoming rarer, Choice Band, multiple layers of spikes, Permanent Sun, Calm Mind, and Pressure, Ho-Oh became an enormous, outbait, underrated threat in the 3rd generation. Now, it wasn't a poster child for the tier like the Laddie Twins and the Weather Titans, but it was seriously potent. It had an absolute plethora of highly viable sets. Its most prominent variant, it's a specially defensive set that does incredibly well against the majority of the tier, which is primarily composed of special attackers, with Groudon Sun support to lower Thunder's accuracy to 50% and weaken water moves. Ho-Oh was easily able to utterly destroy the Laddie Twins and Mewtwo while spreading status that wasn't shrugged off easily onto everything, including its nemesis, Kyogre, with a simple Sacred Fire, Recover, Toxic, and Shadow Ball set. It was so bulky that even a max special attack Kyogre Hydro Pump only had about a 44% chance to kill it from full, and the more common Surf maxed out at around 85% damage. Now of course, Blissey didn't mind the set of Ho-Ohs too much and could even try to Heal Bell burns and poisons off its teammates, but if it switched in expecting the defensive set and was instead met with a Choice Banded attack, Blissey was in trouble. Both variants were incredibly good with spikes, since opposing flyers were not good Ho-Oh counters, and Ho-Oh obviously threatening the daylights out of Fortress, who is basically the only spinner in Ubers. Alongside Deoxys defense, arguably the tier's best spiker, the two made quite a powerful defensive pressure recover core. And speaking of non-Ubers and Ubers, steel types such as Metagross, Jirachi, and Steelix were quite common due to the power of the Laddie Twins, and Ho-Oh shredded them as well. Some players tried to use Ho-Oh to lure Kyogre with a Calm Mind Thunder set, which seemed fine as it allowed for ultra powerful Sacred Fires. Although being a pure special sweeper was not Ho-Oh's forte, it would now struggle with the Laddie Twins, and it was usually better off wearing Kyogre down with spikes and Toxic or Choice Banded attacks before switching to a Laddie Twin to threaten the opponent further. This allowed Ho-Oh to play to its strengths and defending against some of the biggest powerhouses in the tier, while reliably damaging the opponent. Overall, Ho-Oh was an underrated beast with some depth to its game, but still hard to stop even if you knew what was coming. Now on to Diamond and Pearl. You already know what I'm going to talk about first. The introduction of Stealth Rock was incredibly crippling to Ho-Oh, as it is with a lot of Pokemon, and when it could only switch in a few times, it was a lot tougher to gain use out of it. Spinning was also quite difficult with the power of Giratina, and in Platinum, Giratina Origin. The physical special split also meant Ho-Oh had no strong stab to dent Kyogre with, and with those things running choice specs now, no one wanted to give them free switches. Other threats like Dialga, Palkia, and Garchomp also didn't make life easy for Ho-Oh at all. And sure, nothing really liked taking a Sacred Fire burn, but Ho-Oh was so difficult to safely get in that it was not used by most top players. And outside of a few gimmicky stall teams that used it alongside its counterpart Lugia, it was mostly forgotten through the generation. That is, until Heart Gold and Soul Silver came out, and gifted Ho-Oh Brave Bird. It went from being helpless against Kyogre to utterly walloping it. And the same goes for Giratina Origin form. Stealth Rock was still very much an issue, but now Ho-Oh was actually worth clearing the field of Stealth Rocks or simply dealing with it. Heatran becoming prominent in the latter stages of the generation meant that many teams that relied on it to take common fire attacks would crumble, since Ho-Oh could just earthquake it to death. And an enormous special defense and roost meant Ho-Oh didn't care much for Giratina Origin, Latios, and Dialga's Draco Meteors, as well as Palkia's Spatial Rend and Darkrai's Dark Pulse. And this also meant that many common offensive teams struggled to damage it as they were pounded into dust, with Sun doing its usual job of jacking up Sacred Fire, making Thunder accuracy a coin flip, and now making sure Palkia's Water Stab was a non-factor. Even Groudon wasn't a safe bet because it often ran Rock Polish and a Swords Dance set, with Dragon Claw as the final attack, because the Lati twins and Giratina Origin were so important to be able to kill, and without Stone Edge, Ho-Oh feasted on it. Being able to easily one-hit KO Fortress made it a natural pairing alongside Spikes as well, and against hardcore stall teams, even defensive Kyogre and Giratina would be hard-pressed to stand up to it. If one could commit to the monstrous task of dealing with Stealth Rock, be it via pulling off a spin, preventing it with taunt, sleep or offensive pressure, or simply getting Ho-Oh in before they went up, it could produce some pretty tremendous results, despite being so high maintenance in nature. And with that, Ho-Oh went through a drastic change in the Ubers tier of the 4th generation. And as for VGC, yes, we actually do have VGC for Gen 4. And while much of Gen 4 VGC is lost to the sands of time, Ho-Oh did actually appear quite prominently in several Japanese regionals. Although unfortunately, we have found games showing that it was in the finals matches of these regionals, but we don't really know their names. But they're there, and if you want to go watch them, the links are in the description down below. But yeah, this was of course during VGC 2010, which was Gen 4's year of allowing 2 Ubers, similar to 2016 of Gen 6. But as far as more prominent tournaments go, Ho-Oh was used by Alan and Ryan Chambers to reach 7th and 8th place at VGC Worlds 2010, respectively. Now, unfortunately, we could only find one of the matches that they participated in, but what we found was that this Ho-Oh had Focus Sash, so that it could presumably take at least one hit from Kyogre or Groudon, or a Rock Slide for that matter, and it could go for burns while being generally difficult to kill via Sacred Fire. Now, from these results, and from the fact that most of the regionals teams didn't really carry Ho-Oh, we could surmise that it wasn't quite exactly a metagame staple, but it did have its time in the sun. Alright, now on to Gen 5. Black and White was largely the same story for Ho-Oh. It wasn't a staple, and it didn't appreciate several new Arceus forms, like Electric and Ghost, but it also dominated a few of them, like Fighting and Grass. And some players even used Flame Charge Sweepers to surprise the opponent with sudden speed, but Ho-Oh usually assumed one of its more traditional bulky roles. It also enjoyed spots on the newly powerful Sand teams, as they boasted the excellent Rapid Spinner Excadrill, and these teams were often highly effective against nearly everything. The real kicker, however, was Black and White 2, where Ho-Oh gained its Dream Road ability, Regenerator. It became absolutely terrific here, and was so prominent in the metagame that Fighting Arceus began using support sets with Stone Edge, despite having to have a minus attack nature for this to be legal, solely just for Ho-Oh. At first, Ho-Oh used a physically defensive set that shut Blaziken and Psystrike Mewtwo down extraordinarily hard. Offensive sub-roost variants were also prominent for their ability to really abuse the ever-present Ferrothorn and more safely run Life Orb, but eventually it began using straight-up Choice Band with Sleep Talk, since it really only needed its stabs and Earthquake. And this, alongside its terrific special bulk, let it switch into and destroy the devastatingly dangerous Darkrai. It was also one of the best checks to the prominent Calm Mind Ghost Arceus, and did not care for anything Genesect or Giratina Origin wanted to do, thus giving its team a ton ton of utility. It was usable on all sorts of teams, including fast-paced offensive squads, which it hadn't really appeared on before, with Choice Scarf Genesect to keep momentum with Focus Sash and Espeon to deny hazards with Magic Bounce. Ho-Oh was well supported and would dish out ludicrous damage. And with that, Ho-Oh finally came into its own and ended the generation as a real premier threat in Ubers. Now on to Gen 6. Ho-Oh was a threat from the very beginning of XY. With the fog coming into existence and being easy to fit on Arceus forms, it became even more top tier. Now, it didn't enjoy Groudon Sun no longer being permanent, but it did enjoy Kyogre's Rain getting the same treatment. Choice Band sets with Sleep Talk were a highly useful, easy fit again, because Darkrai was once more a terror on hyper offense, and while it wasn't a full-blown counter to Xerneas, it could at least help in the collective anti-Xerneas effort that every team needed, often being EV'd to live a +2 Thunder from full health. It also utterly destroyed Veltal, whose Oblivion Wings and Dark Aura Dark Pulses sliced through most other teams and checked Mega Lucario. Ho-Oh didn't need to invest in defense at all, since it checked these incredibly dangerous Pokemon and was an offensive powerhouse, so it was quite popular. Also, Klefki and Mega Scizor were highly common to deal with Xerneas, so Ho-Oh could often be paired with it for easy entry to dish out some highly powerful attacks. Sand with Excadrill was also quite common to check Xerneas, and this was relevant to Ho-Oh because Excadrill could also spin Stealth Rocks for it. Ho-Oh's Sand teams were once more incredibly solid, not just because of their type synergy, but because Ho-Oh's biggest issues were being paired with a defogging Arceus that didn't match up well against a solid hyper offense team with taunts, offensive pressure, and smart use of Darkrai's Dark Void, which would then mean Ho-Oh was starting at 50% and would easily get run over by just about every Pokemon. Excadrill alleviated this greatly, thanks to its speed and Ghost being less common on these teams, so it didn't even necessarily need Tyranitar's help. And upon the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, a lot of stuff changed for Ho-Oh. Its Sacred Fire would no longer be sun boosted unless it faced an opposing Primal Groudon, which was also part fire, so it couldn't be burned, and resisted it to boot. Although given how much special defense it ran for Xerneas and Primal Kyogre, in addition to not being able to hold leftovers, this hit still stung. Primal Kyogre was now completely immune to Sacred Fire and thus couldn't be burned. Realistically though, Ho-Oh preferred to spam Brave Bird anyway, since Mega Salamence existed as well, and it ran Refresh or Facade, which alongside Roost would run through Sacred Fire's 8 PP pretty quickly, making Brave Bird the superior move to use in most cases, especially given Water Arceus' popularity and the lack of flying resist on many Ubers teams. This meant Ho-Oh paired up with Mega Salamence quite often for a dual flying attack that was tough to deal with and gave legitimate use to the less popular Arceus Rock. Oraz also provided even more ways to deal with Stealth Rock. Soul Dew Laddie Twins were released and they quickly rose as premier defoggers, and the new Mega Sableye and its Magic Bounce came along to help out on more balanced teams. Sableye was especially great at putting a stop to the Deoxys hyper offense team that has sometimes plagued Ho-Oh and XY. And with that, Ho-Oh was one of the best offensive defensive weapons in the tier, and it remained a prime threat in the Oraz Ubers metagame despite the big changes that affected it. And as for VGC, in the Uber year of 2016, Ho-Oh wasn't as outrageously prominent as the Primals, unsurprisingly, or Mega Rayquaza and Xerneas, but it did have a niche. Resisting Xerneas' Moonblast is no joke, and it's typing praise on Primal Groudons that lack rock moves. This is an incredible combination of Pokemon to handle. It was also a huge offensive threat. John Hugh used a substitute set, making it doubly difficult to take down and easing its ability to smack everything in sight to great effect to win the Brooklyn Premier Challenge. And other placements include, and again I'm so sorry if I butcher any of your names, but Jonas Yu Meng Chao reached 7th at the Singapore Regionals, Li Kwok Chuen reached 8th at the Hong Kong Regionals, Leos Woltersdorf reached 19th at the Germany Nationals, and Christian Ramirez reached 3rd at the Mexico Regionals. Now with that said, Ho-Oh wasn't seen as much as some of the more defining Pokemon, and it showed since it actually didn't have any notable placements at Worlds that year, but it definitely at least had an effective niche in the metagame, so it at least did something. But I suppose it's hard to give up one of your 2 restricted Pokemon slots for Ho-Oh when you have the Primals and all those other great Pokemon. And finally, Sun and Moon. Ho-Oh once again was incredible from day one, and it was initially used on insanely brutal stall teams alongside lower tier threats like Mega Slowbro and Alolan Muck to wall what seemed like everything in existence. Even though Zygarde Complete's existence meant Ho-Oh had a pretty good general switch now, the large snake still wouldn't appreciate being dealt a burn or toxic that would force a rest. Offensive Ho-Oh sets also weren't bad, as if it needed a little extra strength, it could force its way past most things. Brave Bird powered up into Supersonic Sky Strike, which blew past weakened Primal Groudon, Zygarde Complete, and Arceus forms, being able to easily terrify while possessing longevity against one of the most immovable new walls around in Celesteela was also a highly desirable set of traits for an offensive Pokemon and let it crush a lot of common defense. Come Ultra Sun and Moon, however, Ho-Oh got even better. The meme was dead, Regenerator was now finally compatible with Defog, and Ho-Oh sets before always had slots to spare. Now it could finally take on the Sneaky Pebbles itself. This let it contribute even more significantly to the already toughest Nails teams it fit on. Necrozma Duskmane also joined the tier, and Ho-Oh absolutely destroyed most variants of it. Now of course I'd have to watch out for Stone Edge and Toxic from both it and Primal Groudon, both when simply walling them and when trying to defog away their Stealth Rock, and there is also always the tiny potential problem of Duskmane transforming into Ultra Necrozma and delivering a brutal light that burns the sky, but we're talking Ubers here. Of course, the Pokemon are incredibly powerful and have ways to threaten even their checks. These issues are not the most difficult to surpass with team support either. Being a solid check to the terrifying Marshadow is also not something to be ignored, and overall Ho-Oh remains a terrific, reliable, highly important Pokemon in the Ultra Sun and Moon metagame today. And as for Gen 7 VGC, in the 2018/2019 Sun series, the rules were as follows. You're allowed to, once again, have two so-called restricted Pokemon, except this time you have no Z Crystals, Mega Stones, Primals, or Mega Rayquaza. Ho-Oh was already decent with those things around, and the Z moves, so it was pretty good in this format, since it had naturally high stats that would usually tower over an opponent that didn't have some sort of artificial push to its power. For example, Tapu Koko not being able to use Gigavolt Havoc. Speaking of, Ho-Oh's item choice was pretty varied. It could use terrain-based berries, it could use pinch berries, it could use resist berries. It was very varied. Sorry. And its bulk alongside Recover made it tough to take down, and that in conjunction with its Fire Stab made it a terrific toxic staller. But Ho-Oh wasn't an entirely selfish Pokemon though, as it used Tailwind to support its teammates. So as you can see, there was a lot of variation to Ho-Oh this time around, as it was actually used by a good amount of people, with some notable placements. Daniel Thorpe reached 7th at the Anaheim Regionals with it, Terry Hong reached 3rd at the Portland Regionals, Andrew Burley and Kyle Livinghouse reached 2nd and 8th respectively at the Philadelphia Regionals, Fevzi Ozkan, Nicole Said, and Eric Rios reached 14th, 15th, and 16th at the Frankfurt Regionals, and Carl Schatzberger reached 3rd at the Memphis Regionals. So yeah, Ho-Oh was quite a powerful Pokemon with a varied set of tools in the VGC Sun series. And now I suppose we'll just have to wait and see how Ho-Oh does as the circuit completes itself with the Moon series. And that's it. So how good was Ho-Oh actually? Well, and this is by Uber standards, of course, it started off with some variability in its potential usefulness, but it also had some pretty notable downsides. Overall, it was pretty decent and could potentially be really strong, but it was not the most consistent performer thanks to a number of different factors from generation to generation. You know, like it's, that typing. But then it was reborn from the ashes and became an absolute menace upon receiving Regenerator. This, alongside various other additions, was the spark it needed that led to it getting better and better with every subsequent generation. Well, that and better ways to deal with Stealth Rock, of course. Its VGC appearances showed it was no slouch in the doubles department either. Now, compared to some of the other more prominent restricted Pokemon, it wasn't exactly a staple, but it was still pretty good. Overall, Ho-Oh was one fantastic Pokemon, but surprisingly, by Uber standards, it actually wasn't that consistent. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and if you want to vote for the next Pokemon, be sure to go to the community tab of this YouTube channel and vote on the latest post there, which should go up around the same time as this video is released. And as for the comments, tell me what you think about competitive Ho-Oh. What's your opinion on it? How would you change it? Etc, etc. And of course, thank you so much to the patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms, and that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.